It is considered one of the most important political meetings of the Chinese Communist Party. We'll discuss expectations for the third plenum now underway in Beijing. Hello, I'm Mike Walter sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The 20th CPC Central Committee started its third plenary session in Beijing on Monday. During the four-day meeting, China's political leadership is expected to discuss deepening reforms, long-term economic development, and advancing Chinese modernization. China is working to become a high-level socialist market economy by 2035. For more on the third plenum, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Bristol in the UK, Liang is a chair professor of economics at Willamette University. Also with us from Beijing, Qiang is the assistant director of the International Monetary Institute. Andy Mock is a senior research fellow with the Center for China and Globalization. Victor Gao is chair professor with Soochow University in Beijing. Want to welcome all of you to the broadcast. Victor, why don't I start with you? Historically, of course, the third plenum, a big deal. In 1978, as you well know, the reform and opening up policy that served for the blueprint for China's economic rise unveiled the third plenum in 2013 under President Xi's leadership, marking a new era of reform. So that, as the backdrop, give us a sense of what you're expecting this week.
Thank you very much for having me. Today is the first day of the four-day third plenary session of the current Party Congress. You can literally feel it in Beijing because of the heightened security, and lots of people are exchanging views as to what exactly is happening at the third plenary session. According to already published information, I think this session is widely expected to become another turning point in Chinese political and economic life. Why? Because China needs to make another major decision as to how to do with the economic and political reform, how to open wider to the outside world, how to overcome all the headwinds created by certain countries, especially the United States, and how to eventually emerge as a successor and as a winner. And a lot of things we'll talk about what exactly is the Chinese style modernization, and what are the pros and cons, and what should be promoted, what should be better charted, and focusing on science and technology as what we have been recently called new productivity and new kind of modernization based on technological innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship. So there is a lot of expectation as to what exactly will be the final communique of the third plenary session. You mentioned the third plenary session of the 13th Party Congress, which really was a major breakthrough point, because ever after that plenary session in 1978, China started the reform and opening to the outside world, leading to a completely transformed China today. So we need to think about what will be China become in another 10 years or 25 years or by the middle of the century. A lot of these things will be decided in the coming 3 years at this third plenary session. Huge expectation on this plenary session.
Andy, as Victor says, this is kind of a crossroads, as he says, another turning point in the history of China in many respects. As we know, President Xi has described reform as the driving force for development. So with that frame that he just gave us, what are your expectations?
Well, I completely agree that this third plenum is taking place at a very important time, not only for China, but for the world. So Victor touched on the 13th third plenum where Deng Xiaoping announced reform and opening, and we saw the results that this delivered for China and the world. But it's also worth pointing out, this is the third plenum of the new era. And we see here a continuity that I think is very important to point out, that the direction China has taken since the beginning of the new era has not changed. And Mike, as you said, it's about emphasizing reform, it's about common prosperity, making sure that the fruits of development are equitably spread to all of the people of China. And we've seen all around the world, including in China, some of the imbalances that can occur from rapid growth. But at the same time, I think this plenum takes place at a very important juncture for the world. And the third plenum typically focuses on economic issues. As we've seen with the escalation in tensions with the United States, this is posing a challenge to China, and an appropriate response is very important. I think certainly will fall under some of the discussions and the decisions taken at this third plenum. But at the same time, I think what is not appreciated as much is the danger of global chaos, if I may use this term, black swan events that I think China needs to be prepared for, and economics and economic policy is at the core of formulating effective responses.
Qiang, economic policies at the core, as Andy points out, and as long as we're talking about economic performance, new numbers out Monday. National Bureau of Statistics showing that China's economy grew by 4.7% in the second quarter. I want to get your thoughts on that in just a moment, but first, let's watch this report from our reporter, Joan Fei.
China's gross domestic product has reached 61.68 trillion yuan, or $8.65 trillion in the first half of 2024. That's a 5% growth year on year. The National Bureau of Statistics has released separate figures for first two quarters, showing the country's GDP expanded 5.3% in Q1 and 4.7% in Q2.
The overall economy is stable and has made progress. Production has grown steadily and demand continues to recover. Employment and prices are generally stable. People's income continues to increase. New driving forces have accelerated growth, and high-quality development has seen new progress.
The latest figures show how China is forging clusters of strategic emerging industries with international competitiveness.
Examples include drones, low-altitude economy, new energy vehicles, green economy, large language models, and so on. Whether in manufacturing or service industries, some iconic companies are constantly developing, providing new fields of growth for the Chinese economy.
China had set the goal in March for the country's annual GDP growth at around 5%. This is a target under the consideration of evolving dynamics at home and abroad.
China is the second largest economy in the world, with such a large volume, and the external environment is not very certain. It is indeed something to be proud of to have achieved such results.
The National Bureau of Statistics says overall economic growth relies on the support from policy incentives, rebound in external demand, and development of new quality productive forces. Zhao Yunfei, CGTN, Beijing.
So, Qiang, with that as background, how do you view these numbers?
Well, I think China is meeting expectation at the beginning of the year. I still remember we discussed about Chinese economic growth of the 2024 is going to be around 5%. And judging from the numbers from the first half of the year, I think 5% is a solid gain. And if you take like the breaking down numbers, you'll find out, well, export and import are making a great gain. For example, our trade surplus has been about 99 billion US dollar, which is like more than 40% than the same period of time last year. And taking a look at the CPI number, which is the inflation, it's getting back to the positive zone, which is more than 0.2%. And also the GDP growth minus the inflation, we basically got a solid 5% of the real GDP growth. This is very, very cherishable because against the current background of the whole world, the solid actual GDP growth is a very, very good result for not only China, but also for the rest of the world. And also taking a look at the numbers in the employment and also in the service sectors, manufacturing sectors, we all seen good sign of the solid recovery. And what's worth mentioning here is that the high-tech manufacturing, especially for the high-tech services, for example, the research and the development sectors are growing rapidly. They're both looking at the double-digit growth compared to the same period of last year. So we've been seeing there not only a solid recovery for Chinese economy, but also the shifting gears and also the restructuring and optimized economic structures. because China right now at the threshold of the middle-income country moving towards a high-income country, according to the UN standard, which is like $13,000 GDP per capita, and China is just like the threshold. When China crossed that threshold, I think China really needs this new quality productive forces and the Chinese-style modernization to support Chinese economy to go to higher ground. So I think this shows the sign that China is making it, and also I think the dynamics are going to extend to the future.
Let me ask you a follow-up, because we look at external and internal. When you look at external factors, Andy Mock bringing up kind of the volatility out there on the world stage. I mean, we just saw these elections in France. You didn't know what direction they were going to go in. There's elections here in the United States in November. No one knows how that's going to play out. Obviously, that's going to impact China. Domestically, is that the shining light? External factors still a bit of a concern? How do you view that?
Well, basically, the uncertainty of the whole world can be a problem, not only geopolitical conflicts, but also the whole domestic, politic issues around major countries in the whole world. Just take a look. We have more than 60% of the population at the grand election of this year. So this uncertainty can be a very important problem. But very fortunately, China continued with its continuity and also stability. I think this is something very important and very good for the whole society, especially for the supply chain. And of course, we think the uncertainty in the whole world can be a problem, combining with real estate sectors in China as well as consumption sectors in China really need more of the support. But we're very confident because China maintained very cherishable stabilities and continuities. So I think this is going to be good for China in the coming 1 or 2 years, and also good for the whole world.
Ian, I just got back from China. I was there for almost a month, and you're just kind of, and of course I haven't been there in quite a while with COVID and everything. You're just kind of, it's gobsmacking what you see. I mean, you go to the hotels, there are robots flying all over the place. I mean, you go to some of these EV manufacturing sites, and the robotics, just, it's overwhelming how quickly they can produce a car. EV cars just rolling off the assembly line like crazy. So you think about what's going on, you can see that the engine's chugging along. As you look into the numbers, where are the bright spots? And still, obviously, you have to be concerned about where there might be some headwinds. How do you view things?
Right. Good to talk to you, Mike. So I completely agree. I think, China's economy has built really solid momentum. And I agree with the speaker from the Bureau of Statistics. There are three major reasons. One has to do with policy support, second, external factors, and third has to do with this new quality productive forces that have been transforming China's economic structure, but also pushing China's growth forward. So start with the policy support. I think, this new plenum is going to launch new policies that will be continuing to deepen the reform and opening, for the next era of growth. And I agree with Andy, continuity is the theme, right? That China has talked about high quality growth back in 2017 and has been followed that path, and now is developing of, core and emerging technologies and upgrade the traditional technologies to materialize the innovation and productivity driven economy. And then the external factor, I think is very interesting. Starting the year, many people said, China's high growth cannot be sustainable because all these protectionism policies, which is true. We see 3 times more protectionist policy last year than before the COVID. But at the same time, I think China's export performance has been, remarkable because of all the innovations, all the, competitiveness. The export has grown by 6.9% in the first half of this year. And especially when you look at the structure of the exports, a lot comes from the so-called new trail, right? The EVs, the batteries, and also solar panels that have grown by 30%. And China also has expanded, outreach and market bases in the global south. So I think a lot of these will continue to drive that external demand, despite, as some of the speakers talked about, the volatile political and economic geopolitical environment. And then last but not least, I think this new quality productive growth, would remain the big central theme of the current plenum. And I think, there will be a lot more efforts on investing in basic research, in reform the market to make it more conducive to production, to productive innovations, supporting the private sector, right, which account for 60% of output, 70% of employment, and 70% of tax and 80% of employment, and also play a pivotal role in technological innovations. So I think all of these three very important driving forces for China will continue to consolidate and will continue to build the momentum.
Jan, just to follow up, you said if you're looking for anything dramatic, forget it. And as Andy pointed out, continuity, the big thing. So what type of policy changes are we going to expect? Like incremental changes? I mean, what do you expect to come out of this?
Right. So I think from a lot of the Western point of view, what China is needed, as they think, is a big untargeted transfer payments from the government to the households. They're pointing out, for example, the the retail sales growth has been relatively weak, only gone up, by 3.7%, I think, in the first half. And so they take it as a reason that we need to have a bazooka kind of transfer payment to the households. But I don't think this is the way China considers to stimulate on the demand side. I think for China, give people fish, it's less good than teach people how to fish. So to create stable and high-paid jobs and help, to provide training and create jobs, especially for the young people, also, help the rural residents to be able to spend more by providing, relaxation on hukou restrictions and reform their rural homestead, land reforms, and also, trying to provide more social programs at the local levels, right? Provide more healthcare support, pensions, and education. So I think all of this will help to reduce people's precautionary saving and help to stimulate the demand. Let's not forget, the households, the real growth of the per capita income has grown by 5.3% in the first half of this year. So that means, their income growth is faster than the GDP growth. And yet their consumption is not matching up. I think it's because of this kind of precautionary savings due to the real estate correction. The real estate investment has gone down by 10.1% this first half. So I think a lot can be done to provide more confidence and provide more social safety net and provide more equal footing for the rural residents to spend more and migrant workers as well, rather than simply giving, untargeted transfer payments, which had proved over time that didn't work very well in the Western world in any ways.
Yeah, very interesting. Victor, I mentioned I was in China for about a month. Right after that, I went on vacation to Greece, and there in Athens, the Piraeus port. I mean, you see a sign of China's footprint outside of the country. I mean, from Kazakhstan to Greece, Ethiopia, these infrastructure deals as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. You're seeing new roads, ports, bridges, railroads. 150 countries now have joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. What do you think of the future of that effort?
Well, indeed, whatever that's happening in China has international connection to that. So we are not doing purely for domestic side of the equation. It's all for both domestic and international. I would say China's participation and the impact on the international side of the equation is expected to further increase in the coming years. Why? Because we will continue to push for the traditional strengths like infrastructure, normal trade, for example. However, China has gained a lot of advantages in the recent decade or so in terms of science and technology. For example, EV, for example, semiconductor, artificial intelligence, you name it, in almost every sector in science and technology, China is pushing to the real forefront. And China will be very happy to share its experiences and know-how with all the participating countries of the BRI or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you name it. And I think more and more countries will be interested in looking ways to work with China, not only in continuing to promoting the traditional way of trading, but the new way of trading. Further, I think China will play an increasingly more important role in finance, because China is not only financially rich with capital to invest abroad, but also China itself will become a magnet of capital from outside of China. Why? Because of its political stability, pro-business environment, for example, and if we can figure out a way how to stabilize the domestic equity market and further increase the bond market in China, together with the imminent internationalization of the renminbi, especially the speeding up of the digital renminbi, then you will see in terms of the financial activities, capital investment both inside into China and outside of China to the rest of the world, there will be added momentum in the financial connectivity between China and the rest of the world. You should also know that the Saudi Arabia's investment arm just recently announced setting up a large presence of up to about 100 billion US dollars in China. And that itself will serve as a major bridge and connectivity, bringing more Middle Eastern money to China, not only from Saudi Arabia, but also from UAE, Qatar, you name it. And I think this kind of increased capital flow both ways will be a megatrend in the coming few years. And I hope the third plenum would also touch upon this very important phenomenon.
Yeah, Andy, it's interesting. I want to go back to what Liang was saying. You know, the export growth going up 6.9%. All of that with the backdrop that the trade tensions between the United States and China still continue. I mean, there's really been no real reduction on those Trump tariffs under the Biden administration. So this really is kind of a remarkable story, isn't it?
Well, Mike, it is and it isn't. So this is a complex phenomenon. So clearly, the U.S. government has taken actions specifically designed to stop, maybe reverse China's growth, reduce the amount of interaction, trade, and investment between the U.S. and China. And the data shows it clearly hasn't worked, and it hasn't worked for several different reasons. So one thing we've seen, despite the tariffs that were placed during the Trump administration, as at the same time, not to get too into the macroeconomics of this, but rising U.S. interest rates, which raises the U.S., makes the dollar stronger and, of course, the RMB more competitive. So that's a very important force. We look at technology, an area I spend a lot of time on. Semiconductor equipment manufacturers like Applied Materials, Lam Research, have seen their revenues to China skyrocket by double-digit increases because while some of the more advanced products and services they offer are prohibited, they're selling even more of the more commodified services. So I think this is very interesting. I want to come back to this point about expectations for the third plenum. You know, this is largely about structural type issues, whereas the Central Economic Work Conference might be a little bit more towards operational details. And some of the things I think are very important to keep an eye on is what is going to happen in the financial sector. You know, there's an international component to this that China has been very insightful about learning from the mistakes of other countries, whether that's the Soviet Union or the United States. And I think one important question is what is the appropriate role of the financial sector in a country's economy? And we've seen in the United States, I think one of the problems is the over-financialization of the economy. And this has not only a negative impact on the ordinary lives of Americans, but also undermines national security. So I think this is a very important issue to keep an eye on. The other thing I would point out, too, is in the area of advanced manufacturing. So this is, again, somewhat of a black box to many consumers. But I wouldn't be too surprised if we see before too long coming out of China the same manufacturing line that can produce smartphones can also produce EVs. And if those that are in the manufacturing sector know that it's tremendously expensive and time-consuming to retool, to switch lines, even from different versions of a product. And we see China leading through industrial automation, robotics, and now artificial intelligence, that we may see a turbocharged manufacturing sector in China that is not only producing new products more cheaply at a higher quality, but in a more sustainable way because they can change very quickly. When something is working, they can produce more of it. When something is not selling, they can very quickly stop it without a lot of wastage or loss. So to me, some of these bigger picture structural reforms, I think, are very, very important to keep an eye on. Oh, one other quick thing is what happens with the local government. You know, one of the structural changes I think is well recognized that is needed is how should local governments in China fund themselves that are more sustainable, more transparent, and more accountable. So I think these are challenging issues, but certainly I think China has the depth of expertise and the experience that it's accumulated not just since '78, but again, this is the third third plenum of the new era, that these are some very, I think, exciting things to keep an eye on.
In Yuan, during the two sessions, I think Wang Yi said something to the effect of the door's open, we're open for business, obviously wanting to invite more foreign investment. We've seen international, multinational companies like Apple, Tesla, Nike, the list goes on and on, going to China. How about the current business environment and atmosphere in terms of attracting that type of investment or operations, collaborations in China?
Right. I think that's a great question. I think this is important to, again, talk about China's high-level opening. So one thing is the continuous expansion of market access for foreign investors, and also welcome investors to certain sectors that China desire to improve. For example, services sector. I think it's important to point out last year, there has been a 39.7% increase in the newly formed foreign enterprises in China, and 53,000 new foreign invested enterprises have been set up in China. Even though I do think that the scale of foreign investment has declined, but at the same time, I think this is an important transition time because China is different. Now, there's a lot more market competition for the domestic-oriented, market-oriented FDI. But also for export-oriented FDI, they also need to think about when and which sector to enter. So I think there's still, some of the wait-and-see sort of attitudes. And that's why I think we're not seeing as much foreign direct investment as in the previous, peak years back in, 2021, 2022. That said, I think it's continuous clear that China is welcoming these foreign investors, not for very much the foreign capital, but rather for the technologies, for their know-hows. And at the same time, as I think mentioned earlier, China is also going out, right, through BRI, through global development initiatives. And I think in the past 10 years, we have seen a lot of public investment, setting up infrastructure, setting up some of the basic utilities and so on and so forth. And now we're seeing a lot more private enterprises like BYD that has been invested in Thailand, in Turkey, in Hungary, and we also see, CATL. So I think, and Huawei, right? So I think all of these are very important to know that China has continued to have this kinds of high-level open policies. And I would last just add quickly on the fiscal reform. I think the point is not for just how, to discipline the local governments, but really to rebalance the spending and revenue sources, responsibilities, right, between the central and local governments. We know that local governments are so important in not only, boosting the local economies, but providing very essential social programs. So going back to this idea of supporting the consumption demand, I think it's important to beef up the local governments to allow them to be able to provide these social safety nets. At the same time, I think it's also very important as we resolve this local government debt. This is very essential for financial stability and financial reform as well.
Well, I want to thank all four of you. Some tremendous insights. As you've certainly set the table for the third plenum. We're going to be watching closely. I know you will be as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. What a pleasure. That's all the time we have. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.